This is argument analysis and evaluation. And of the most important thing to do in critical thinking is to be able to analyze an argument and then assess if the argument is good or not good. But arguments are not always written in a in a strict, formal manner. By where you will be able to identify which part is the premise or premises and which part is the conclusion. Because an argument may be a thesis itself, or a term paper, or just a short article in the newspaper. We've talked about different types of arguments already. So in this presentation, I will be discussing about how to analyze an argument and how to assess if the argument is good or not good, valid or invalid, sound or unsound, correct or fallacious, etc. So before we go into the analysis of an argument, let's talk about context. And we have discussed already context before. And when you say context, an argument is always presented within a set of values, set of rules, on principles, beliefs, a system of knowledge within which that particular argument is meaningful. And by meaningful means that the argument will make sense. It is through the context that we assess, based on the context that we assess, we evaluate the argument, whether it is valid, it is a good argument, a established argument, a supported argument, etc., etc. Okay, because the meaning of an argument, or not just of the argument, even of a particular sentence or proposition, or even a word, the meaning of those things will depend on the context. You change the context, then everything, the meaning of the whole thing changes. Like, for example, when I use the word mass, what is a mass? How do we define mass? In order for us to define mass, we have to provide a context. What context? Context of science? In the context of politics? In the context of religion? Mass will have different meanings depending on the context. So an argument should be analyzed, should be evaluated based on the context. The plane, or the field, or the system of knowledge that will include values, rules, principles, theories, concepts, etc., etc., within which arguments are sensible and meaningful. So your area of discipline, your field of study, provides the context for your term paper, for your thesis, for your reports, etc. Okay? So if you are in psychology, psychology provides a context for your work. If you are in the business field, or in the commerce discipline, then commerce has context. So when you talk of money, finances, then it has a particular context. Or if you are in the field of, say, religion, then there is a context. Okay, so we don't assess, we don't analyze particular argument, an article, a paper, term paper, thesis, dissertation, without fully understanding the context within which that piece of article, that piece of writing should be evaluated. Okay, so don't forget the context. You always provide a context, or at least understand the context of a paper or an argument. Now, let's go to argument analysis. So, what do you mean by analysis in the first place. When you analyze one thing, we're trying to break down the parts. So to analyze is to break down the parts, identify the parts. So grammatical analysis, for example, how do we analyze a sentence? Well, we have to identify which one is the subject, which one is the predicate, what is the verb, and so on and so forth. That's analysis. We break down and then identify the different parts. Analysis is the basis of evaluation. It's different from evaluation in the sense that when we evaluate something, we are now saying whether this is good or bad, right or wrong, true or false. So there is already an assessment, an evaluation. And when you do assessment, evaluation, we use a particular set of criteria. So for example, you say, that argument is not good because it is inconsistent. That argument is not good because the information it provides is unreliable or it's not adequate, and so on and so forth. That's evaluation. Analysis is different because we just identify the parts, break down the parts, identify it, but it becomes the basis of the evaluation, because how can you say that the parts are consistent if you don't know, you don't properly identify the different parts? So how can you say that there is no agreement between subject and predicate if you cannot identify which part is the subject and which part is the predicate in grammatical analysis? So of course, people sometimes they interchange, or they would say, analyze if it is right or wrong. Oh, no. When you say right or wrong, you are already passing a judgment. It's already an evaluation, an assessment. You have gone past through analysis. So the critique and the analysis are two different things, but you can actually combine them because you can have a critical analysis. So when you say a critical analysis, meaning you identify the parts and critique whether the parts are coherent, consistent, etc., etc. So the two are different, but in a thesis, in a research, we normally combine them. Critical analysis, critical evaluation, but if you just say analyze, well, to analyze, just identify the different parts. But you don't end up with only an analysis. You actually provide an evaluation, a critique, an assessment. So we're going to do first analysis, and then later on we'll do evaluation. So argument analysis is the identification of the integral parts of the argument, namely the claims or conclusion or hypothesis and the evidence or premises. Okay, and that's quite a complicated thing to do. But since we've already discussed the standard forms of the arguments, we know what is a claim or conclusion, and we know what are the premises. And we've already discussed what are the premises indicators and the conclusion indicators. So they will tell us, well, this part of the argument is the claim, and this part is the premises because of certain indicators. So analysis involves the breaking down of the arguments into its constituent parts. After identifying the parts, the interrelation or the logical connection of these parts is evaluated. That's the evaluation part. That's the critical part, based on certain criteria, like, for example, the criteria of logic and grammar. So this is now how to analyze and reconstruct the argument. By the way, when you write reconstruct, if you have an article, you try to reconstruct it in such a way that you are able to rearrange it so that the premises and the conclusion are properly constructed. So the first step is to identify the claims and the evidence. And we have done this in our previous discussion classes. how to identify conclusions and premises. So note that an argument, as I have already mentioned, may contain several claims or conclusions, like hypothesis, intermediate conclusion, and then, of course, the final conclusion, and several evidence or premises supporting such claims and conclusion. So it's not just two premises then conclusion, two premises. No, it's not always like that. That's the most basic, no. But in some other arguments, it could be very long. Your thesis you're going to write is one argument. Okay, it's a long argument. It may contain intermediate conclusions or claims supporting a general conclusion or the final conclusion. So I'll show you some patterns here later on. Number two, you need to cancel or delete the rhetorical parts. What are these rhetorical parts? Well, they are important in the discussion, in the construction of the argument, to make them readable, understandable, but there are rhetorical in the sense that they may not really be logically important to the argument. They are there to make the argument readable. But if you remove them, the argument will stay the same. I mean, from a logical perspective. So in order to have a clear view of the premises or evidence and claims or conclusion, we need to delete those phrases which are not logically integral or logically significant to the argument. Because they are there as a matter, for example, as a matter of writing, style of writing of the author or the writer, to make the paper or the article readable. And then the third one is to standardize the argument. We restructure the argument and present it in a definite pattern, meaning we have the premises and the evidences and then the claims and conclusion. So this could be a pattern of an argument. I'll present to you all these. Sorry. So E stands for here, E. I hope you can see this. Evidence or proof. IM means intermediate conclusion. FC means the final conclusion. Okay, so for example, the argument may present evidence 1 plus evidence 2. And then, based on these two information or facts or evidence, comes up with a conclusion. So IM means the intermediate conclusion. Then, you can come up with evidence 3 and 4, and then intermediate 2. Okay, and then here, come up with this, and then based on this intermediate conclusion, you have the final conclusion. So that could be a pattern of an argument. Okay? Now, imagine, for example, you're going to write your thesis. So, you have a general statement of the problem. I don't know if you have already taken up thesis writing, but this is how you write a thesis. You write a thesis proposal. So you write a thesis proposal. In the thesis proposal, there will be the general statement of the problem, what you want to write about. And then you provide sub-questions. For example, what is the relevance of X to Y? Let's talk about that. What's the relevance of X to Y? So the first thing that you're going to ask is, what is X? First question, what is X? Second question, what is Y? Third question, and what is the connection between X and Y to show the relevance? Okay, so the first question would be, what is X? What is the importance of X? So you can present X is this, no, evidence one and two, and then therefore X is this. What is Y? Uh, y is this, Y is that, therefore Y is this one, meaning the intermediate conclusion. Okay. Then what is the connection between X and Y? So here you can have the intermediate conclusion, and then when you already know that X is this and Y is this, and X and Y are connected, then you can come up with your final conclusion about the relevance of X to Y. I hope you can follow, you understand, because that's one way of writing your thesis. And your entire thesis is, as I've said, one big argument. Now, aside from that, you can also have this kind of argument. So you see, for example, see evidence one, evidence two, and three, come up with the first intermediate conclusion. Okay? And then you research again from your first intermediate conclusion, you added E4, E5. Okay, so for example, you gather some information here, three information, let's say physical evidence or facts. Based on these facts, you come up with this intermediate conclusion. But that's not yet your final conclusion. These are conclusions based on some facts gathered. You interview expert one, expert two, and based on your interview, plus the facts you gathered, come up with intermediate conclusion number two. But the data and the opinions are not yet enough. So you read more sources. Okay, here E6, E7. And then come up with the third intermediate conclusion. You're not yet satisfied. I mean, I think it's not yet, all these things that I have added are not yet sufficient enough. So what do? I read more, gather more documents, go to the museum or the government library, get some information, and so I have gathered enough evidence here, sources, other sources, opinion, and some other documents until I come up with my final conclusion. So that's a pattern of an argument. So when you look at this is a long argument. No? That's a thesis. That's a long study already. But that's how you restructure the argument. Okay? And there are many other patterns of the argument. I'm just showing you some of the patterns, okay, of the argument. So let's take, for example, this. Okay, I hope you can follow me on this one. I'm sorry. This is actually a short and condensed version of an article written by the columnist in the Inquirer, Randy De Quiros, about the use of English. The use of English in teaching. So this is the gist of the article. I'd like to be clear on one thing in particular. I'm not advocating banishing English from this country. Paradoxical as it may sound, I think English is more likely to prosper in this country with Filipino, meaning the Filipino language, than without Filipino. The basis for that contention is this. English, whether read or spoken, cannot prosper in an illiterate country. Most Filipinos cannot be made literate by starting them off in English. Most Filipinos can be made literate by starting them off in Filipino. The surest path to literacy is a language students understand or feel at home in. That is not English. The use of Filipino, complemented by other local languages, assures literacy and higher comprehension. Quite simply, it is easier to learn to speak, read, and write Filipino than English. Language, not just words. It is culture and sensibility. That is the gist of the article. That's actually a very long article, but I have condensed it to this very short version. And I have already identified some of the logical parts of the argument. Numbered them from one here, if you can see that, 2, 3, 4, 5,
Yes, sir.
6, 7. So I hope you are following. Okay, please follow. So I have numbered that. So here I have already identified the logical parts. So sort of analyze already this, identify. But I have not identified them yet whether they are a part of the conclusion or part of the premise or premises. Okay? So having read this, what do you think is the main claim? What do you think is what is being argued? What is the conclusion? When you try to analyze an argument like this, no, you ask, what is being argued? What is the main point? What's the main point?
Not advocating banishing English from this country.
Not advocating banishing English from this country. Okay, that's actually part of it. But there is a more pointed claim. Focus on 1 to 7. The sentences with numbers. Like for example, 7. Number 7 is language, not just words. It is culture and sensibility. Number 5 is the use of Filipino complemented by other local languages, etc. So 1 to 7, what would be the main point? Okay, let's just experiment on that. If that is the main point, that means the rest of the sentences are the supports, right? The premises. And let's do it this way. I hope you follow me. If that is the main point, the next question to be asked is, why does the author think that most Filipinos cannot be made literate by studying them off in English? Or is there a more specific point than that?
I think it's number 7 po.
Number 7.
Language
Let, let,
is not just words, it is
okay.
culture and sensibility.
Let's read the first two parts, right? So it's like I'd like to be clear on one thing in particular. I am not advocating banishing English from this country. Paradoxical as it may sound, I think English is more likely to prosper in this country with Filipino than without Filipino. And then the next is the basis for that contention is this. So when you look at this, the basis of that contention, what is the object of this phrase? What is he referring to? What contention?
Number
Yes.
one, sir.
Number
It's
one.
it's number one. Of course, without this part, you will be clueless, right? What is the main point? It's difficult. But when you read this part, the basis of that contention, that means this is his contention. Okay, so I'm pointing at number one. This is the main contention because he said the basis of that contention. That means this is what he is contending. This one, English is more likely to prosper in this country with Filipino, meaning Filipino language, than without Filipino language, right? Because of this. Okay, so when you read an article, the author sometimes will give you some some signs, okay, that that is what I'm talking about. And of course, what follows would be the reasons. This will now be the basis. This 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. But
Yes,
when
Yes
you
sir.
look,
po.
good. Now, when you look at 2 and 3, English, whether read or spoken, cannot prosper in an illiterate country. Most Filipinos cannot be made literate by starting them off in English. This actually forms a small argument. So, here, this is actually an enthymeme. Remember our discussion on the enthymeme, right? You're trying to figure if this is the basis of that contention, okay, 2 and 3, which of these two supports the other? Like, for example, should I say English, whether read or spoken, cannot prosper in an illiterate country because most Filipinos cannot be made literate by starting them off in English? Or should I say most Filipinos cannot be made literate by starting them off in English because English, whether read or spoken, cannot prosper in an illiterate country? Between 2 and 3, which is the premise? Is it, so you have to make a kind of thought experiment. Is it 2 because of number 3? Now, when you say because of, that means that's the premise, right? Or should I say it's 3 because of number 2?
Because of number
It's 3 because of number 2. So you say, most Filipinos cannot be made literate by starting them off in English because English, whether read or spoken, cannot prosper in an illiterate country. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it does make sense. All right, now let's go to the second point, 4 and 5. So again, 4 and 5 supports the contention that English is more likely to prosper in this country with Filipino than without Filipino. Okay? Now, when you look at 4 and 5, which of these two would form as the conclusion? So you say, the surest path to literacy is a language students understand or feel at home in. Because the use of Filipino complemented by other local languages assures literacy and higher comprehension. Or should we say, the use of Filipino complemented by other local languages assures literacy and higher comprehension. Because the surest path to literacy is a language understands, or as language students understand or feel at home in. So is it 4 because of 5 or 5 because of 4?
5 because of 4.
Okay, 5 because of 4. That's correct. No? So it makes more sense to say the use of Filipino complemented by other local languages assures literacy because the surest path to literacy is a language students understand or feel at home in. Okay, do you follow, class?
Yes,
Yes?
sir.
Okay. Now, let's go to the last part. So, quite simply, so again, the last part here, this quite simply, is again a support of number 1. So, it is easier to learn to speak, read, and write Filipino than English. And this number 7 is language, not just words, it is culture and sensibility. Should we say it is easier to learn to speak and read and write Filipino than English because language is not just words, it is culture and sensibility? Or we say language is not just words, it is culture and sensibility because it is easier to learn to speak, read, and write Filipino than English? Is it 6 because of 7 or 7 because of 6?
6 because of 7.
Yes, 6 because of 7. Now, with that, we have already identified, analyzed the argument. We can now rearrange this argument actually. Let's just follow me on this. So if you're going to reconstruct now this argument so that we can have the full flow of the argument in a logical, in a logical structure, we can say that 6 because of 7, right? So we say this is the first premise, okay? 7 is the first premise. And the reason for, and the conclusion for that is number 6. So I will 7 here, then 6. We're trying to reconstruct this argument here. So I say, language is not just words, it is culture and sensibility. Therefore, it is easier to learn to speak, read, and write Filipino than with Filipino. And then the next, so this is the first conclusion. So this is the first IM, okay, intermediate, or say IC. This RC, and then 4, and then 4, and the basis for this is 5, okay? And then you have 3, 2, and then 3. And then the final conclusion is number 1. So let's follow this. It will be like this now. Language is not just words, it is culture and sensibility. Therefore, it is easier to learn to speak, read, and write Filipino than English. Number 4 is the surest path to literacy is a language students understand. That is not English. Therefore, the use of Filipino, complemented by other local languages, assures literacy and high comprehension. And then, English, whether read or spoken, cannot prosper in a limited country. Therefore, most Filipinos cannot be made literate by studying them off in English. So, the intermediate conclusions are 6, 5, and 3. So, if you put together 6, 5, and 3, so you say, it is easier to learn how to speak, read, and write Filipino than English. And the use of Filipino, complemented by other local languages, assures literacy. And most Filipinos cannot be made literate by studying of English. Therefore, this is the conclusion. Therefore, English is more likely to prosper in this country with Filipino than without Filipino. So you see here, this is the main contention here. And this is supported by 6, by 5, and by 3. If you look at 2, 4, and 7, you're going to see that 4, 2, and 7, these are general statements about language. See? They're all about language, about the English language. Statements 3 and 5 and 6, they're Filipino, the Filipino language. So the argument goes from general statements about the English language, and it moves to specific propositions about the Filipino language in relation to English. And then the last part, English is more likely to prosper in this country with Filipino than without Filipino, combining English and Filipino. So the argument may have been constructed in a way that the main contention is given at the top, and then the following discussions are all in support of that main contention. Now, that is argument analysis. You try to identify the main point, the main contention, and then identify what are the supporting statements. The supporting statements are the premises. Now, let's go to argument evaluation. So you have already reconstructed the argument, you have analyzed it. Now you want to say whether the argument is good, bad, sound or unsound, correct or fallacious, and so on and so forth. So this will be the basis of your argument evaluation. So you try to determine the validity, the strength, the reliability, the consistency of the argument. So first, know the context of the argument and the particular meaning of key terms. Which again, that will be important in evaluating the strength, the reliability, the consistency of the argument. And this will include checking ambiguous words or words with double meaning, identifying and clarifying confusing ideas, and the next is to evaluate the premises, meaning the evidence, and conclusion or claims. So these are the two important things that you need to do in argument evaluation. Now, here are some specific criteria when you evaluate the argument. We have already discussed many of these because we talk about the evidence. One, clarity of claims and evidence. So the question is, the claim in the premises or the evidence that supports such claim, the question is whether they can be easily identified. Okay, so it depends, of course, in how the argument is being written or crafted or formulated. But you must at least be able to identify what is he talking about? What is the contention of this argument? Okay? And what are the supporting statements of this contention? Next, the acceptability or the premises of the evidence. Okay, so it means that the evidence, okay, the acceptability of the evidence will depend, of course, in the area or in the discipline and on the community of researchers or investigators in that area of discipline. So if you are in science, acceptability will depend on your discipline, accepted by the scientific community. If you're a lawyer, then that means the acceptability of the premise or evidence to the legal community. If you are in business or commerce, to your colleagues in the business. If you are in, say, in psychology, then acceptability of this evidence in your community of psychologists. Okay. So one criterion of acceptability, as we have said, is that it is below the level of dispute among the members of the community or investigators of community of investigators or researchers in that particular discipline. Then, consistency of premise and conclusion. So that means that the conclusion and the claims being made must follow from the premise and evidence. So you have to see how the coherence, no, the consistency, the flow of the argument. And then the relevance. We've talked about relevance of the premise and evidence. It must be significant and directly related to the conclusion or the claims. And then adequacy of support. So the premise and the evidence must be sufficient enough to support the conclusion and claims. Comprehensiveness of the argument. That means that the argument must provide a comprehensive review of issues, data needed to make a reasonable decision or judgment or assessment on a particular topic or the topic at hand. And then, of course, we talk about structural coherence, meaning the argument must smoothly flow. It must flow smoothly from beginning to end. So how the main ideas are presented, how the arguments are presented, the supporting statements are presented towards the conclusion, or if he started with a conclusion, how this conclusion is supported by the following statements. So there must be a logical flow, smooth transition from one idea to another. If you are writing a thesis, there must be a smooth transition from one chapter to another chapter to another chapter until you reach the final conclusion. Okay, so that's the meaning of structural coherence. Okay, uh, here let's just assess this for sake of evaluation. Let's do an assessment of this, evaluation of this. A ranking officer of the military argued for a military build-up to combat terrorism. So argued for. So that by just reading this is the main point of the officer. Military build-up to combat terrorism. Okay, because you have to always look for some clues. Like for example, this is a clue. Argued for. Okay, so he's arguing for this. So what follows should be the support for that argument, right? So he said that in the light of the global threat of terrorism, we should reinstitute military draft in this country. So this is one claim that support this claim. This is one statement, no? Threat of terrorism supporting this. And then he said, after all, we should remember the words of the great American president, John F. Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So this quotation from Kennedy supposedly is supports this. Okay, military draft in this country. Okay, and then he goes on. Our country, the officer said, is surely affected by global terrorism, and a military draft is something we can do for our country. Okay, so what do you think of this argument in terms of validity, in terms of reliability, in terms of adequacy of the strength or adequacy of the premises? So if you're going to analyze this, we know that this will be the main contention, and this would be the support for that contention, and he supports it with this quote from Kennedy, and that the country is affected by global terrorism. So what do you think? So the main argument is military build-up. Military build-up. That's the main point, to combat terrorism. And to combat terrorism, we have to build up our military because there is a global threat. And Kennedy said we should ask what we can do for our country. And the draft is something that we can do for our country. What's your assessment on this? Anyone?
Sir?
Yes? Earl?
Uh, I think the quote from John F. Kennedy is not supporting the main
Okay.
point.
Okay, so,
And he
okay.
quoted that it's ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for our country. I think there should be something training instead of stating John F. Kennedy or sample of a terrorist attack
Okay.
to support the
Yeah.
argument of building up military combat against terrorism.
Okay. So the quote from John F. Kennedy is not, I would say this is just plain rhetoric.
Yes,
But
sir.
it's not really helping the argument for military buildup. So maybe what he can do is present data, right, and other alternatives. Here, this is one example also of how you can try to reconstruct this and come up with your own structure, reconstruction of the argument here. Okay,